Your son was killed in Iran last week. Those were the words my daughter-in-law Rachel said to me the morning she stood on my front porch, and for a moment I truly believed my heart had stopped beating. I remember the way the sunlight fell across the wooden steps of my house in Cedar Ridge, a quiet Ohio town where nothing dramatic ever seemed to happen. I remember the smell of fresh coffee drifting from the kitchen behind me and the faint sound of a lawn mower somewhere down the street. And I remember the way Rachel's voice sounded, calm, almost casual, as if she were telling me about the weather instead of the death of my only son. My name is Margaret Whitmore, I'm 71 years old, and until that morning I believed I understood my family. Jason had been my pride since the day he was born at St. Mary's Hospital nearly 40 years earlier. He grew into the kind of man people trusted, steady, responsible, the sort who called his mother every Sunday evening without fail. After college he went into international engineering work, traveling farther than I ever imagined when I first held him as a baby. Over the past year he had been working on a project in the Middle East, somewhere outside Tehran. The distance worried me sometimes, but Jason always reassured me during our weekly calls. "I'm fine, Mom," he'd say in that steady voice of his. "It's just work. I'll be home before you know it." Rachel had married him 6 years earlier. She was younger than Jason by a few years, with perfectly styled hair and the confident smile of someone who always knew how a room would respond to her. I tried very hard to like her. Mothers usually do. But something about Rachel had always left a small, quiet question in the back of my mind. Still, I told myself that was just my imagination, the way older people sometimes struggle to adjust when their children start new families of their own. That Tuesday morning had begun like any other. I woke at 6, made oatmeal, watered the hydrangeas in the backyard, and listened to the local radio station while the sun climbed over the maple trees. Jason's weekly call was still 3 days away, but I had been thinking about him anyway, wondering whether he might finally be finishing that overseas assignment. Around 8:30 I heard a car door slam outside. When I opened the front door I saw Rachel standing there on the walkway, dressed in a dark coat even though the spring air was already warming towards 60 degrees. She didn't smile. She didn't say good morning. She just looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between impatience and concern. "Rachel?" I asked. "Is everything all right?" That was when she said it. "Your son was killed in Iran last week." The sentence was so blunt, so sudden, that it didn't even make sense at first. My mind searched for another meaning, some explanation that would turn the words into a misunderstanding. But Rachel just stood there watching me, waiting. The porch railing blurred. I felt my knees weaken, and the next thing I knew I was sitting on the cold wooden step, gripping the edge of the doorframe as if the ground itself had tilted beneath me. "No," I whispered. "No, that can't be right." Rachel sighed softly, almost like someone repeating difficult news for the second time. She said Jason had been involved in an incident near one of the facilities where he worked. She said the situation overseas had been complicated and that the company handled everything quickly. According to her, there had already been a private memorial arranged overseas with Jason's colleagues. She told me it had all happened very fast. Too fast, I thought dimly, though grief was already pressing in around my chest like heavy winter air. My thoughts moved through old memories in quick flashes. Jason learning to ride a bicycle on this same street, Jason helping me carry groceries into the house when he was 16, Jason hugging me goodbye at the airport last summer before flying overseas. A person doesn't disappear like that. Not someone who called his mother every week. Why didn't anyone tell me sooner? I asked. My voice sounded small and unfamiliar. Rachel shifted her weight on the walkway. She said the company had needed time to confirm details. She said international communication had been slow. She said she had driven over as soon as she could. Each explanation arrived smoothly, like carefully arranged pieces of a story. I tried to absorb them, but something deep inside me resisted, like a door that refused to close completely. I looked up at her and noticed something strange. Rachel wasn't crying. Not even a little. Her eyes were clear, her posture steady, her expression controlled. People react to grief in different ways, I reminded myself, but the calmness felt wrong somehow, like silence where there should have been thunder. They brought him home? I asked finally. Rachel hesitated for a moment. Just a moment. Then she said the company had arranged a cremation overseas because transporting remains internationally was complicated. She said they would send documentation soon. She said everything had already been handled. The word handled echoed in my ears. I stared out at the quiet street while neighbors' mailboxes glinted in the morning sun. Somewhere down the block a dog barked and a delivery truck rolled slowly past. The world kept moving as if nothing had changed. But my son, my Jason, was suddenly gone. I pressed my hand against my chest and tried to breathe through the wave of grief rising inside me. Yet even in that moment of shock, a faint, stubborn thought flickered through my mind, a thought so small I almost ignored it. Something about the story felt incomplete. Something about Rachel's voice, her timing, her calmness. And as I sat there on the doorstep of the home where Jason had grown up, staring at the woman who had just told me my son was gone, a quiet question began forming deep in my heart, a question I wouldn't understand until much later. What if the story Rachel had just told me wasn't the truth at all? After Rachel left that morning, the house felt strangely hollow, as if the walls themselves were trying to absorb the news she had delivered. I remained on the porch step for a long time, long after her car had disappeared down the quiet street. The sun climbed higher over Cedar Ridge, warming the wooden railing beside me, but I barely noticed. My mind kept circling the same impossible sentence. Your son was killed in Iran last week. I tried to imagine the moment when Jason had supposedly been gone from this world, but my thoughts refused to settle. Instead they drifted through ordinary memories that suddenly felt fragile and distant. Jason laughing at the kitchen table during Thanksgiving. Jason standing in the driveway helping me shovel snow during a winter storm 3 years ago. Jason calling me every Sunday evening, asking if I had remembered to lock the back door or whether I needed anything from the grocery store. People do not simply disappear from life like a television signal switching off. Eventually I forced myself to stand. My legs felt weak, but routine is sometimes the only thing that keeps a person moving when grief tries to pull them down. I walked back inside and closed the door behind me. The coffee pot was still sitting on the counter where I had left it earlier. I poured a cup with hands that trembled slightly and sat down at the kitchen table. The chair across from me was empty, but for some reason I could almost see Jason sitting there the way he used to when he visited, leaning forward with his elbows on the table while telling me about work projects or travel stories from overseas. I wrapped my fingers around the warm mug and tried to focus on what Rachel had told me. She had said everything happened quickly. She had said the company handled the arrangements overseas. She had said there would be documents later. The explanations sounded neat and organized when I repeated them in my mind, yet something inside me continued to resist accepting them. I had lived long enough to recognize when a story felt incomplete. Outside, a pickup truck rolled past the house and the distant sound of children playing somewhere down the block drifted through the open window. Life continued in small ordinary ways while my own world felt suspended between disbelief and sorrow. I looked toward the hallway where the framed photographs of Jason lined the wall. One picture showed him at age 8 holding a fishing rod at Lake Erie. Another showed him graduating from Ohio State University with his arm around me, both of us smiling at the camera. I stood and walked slowly toward those pictures as if they might answer the questions forming in my mind. When I reached the photograph from his graduation, I touched the edge of the frame. Jason had always been careful about keeping in contact while working abroad. Even when he traveled between countries, he always found a way to send a quick message or call. Yet according to Rachel, he had been gone for an entire week before she told me. That detail settled in my thoughts like a loose thread I could not ignore. Why would Jason's company wait so long before contacting his own mother? Why had no one from his employer called directly? Why had the news arrived only through Rachel standing alone on my porch? I returned to the kitchen and sat down again, staring at my phone resting beside the coffee mug. For several minutes I simply watched the screen as if it might suddenly light up with Jason's name. Of course it did not. Finally I opened my email inbox and scrolled through the messages from the past few days. Most were ordinary things like grocery store coupons or newsletters from local community groups. But as I continued scrolling, I noticed the last email Jason had sent me. It had arrived 10 days earlier. The message was simple and typical of him. He wrote that the project was busy but going well, that the weather there was warmer than Ohio, and that he would call on Sunday like always. I read the message 3 times, searching for anything unusual in the words. There was nothing alarming. Nothing that sounded like a man who expected his life to end a few days later. I leaned back in the chair and pressed my hands together, trying to steady my breathing. Grief was still there, heavy and real, but alongside it a quiet uncertainty continued to grow. Rachel had spoken with confidence, yet her calm expression and the strange delay in telling me refused to settle comfortably in my mind. I glanced again at my phone lying on the table. Jason's contact name was still saved exactly the way it had always been. My son Jason. I did not call the number. Part of me was afraid of hearing only silence. Instead I sat there listening to the soft ticking of the kitchen clock while a thought slowly formed, a thought I could not explain yet but could not ignore either. If Jason had truly been gone for an entire week, then why did everything around me still feel as if the story had only just begun? I did not sleep much that night. The house was quiet in the way only an older home can be quiet, with small creaks in the wooden floors and the distant hum of the refrigerator drifting through the hallway. Every time I closed my eyes I heard Rachel's voice again. Your son was killed. In Iran last week. The words repeated themselves until morning light finally slipped through the curtains. I rose slowly from the couch where I had fallen asleep and walked to the kitchen. The clock above the stove read 6:30 in the morning. For 40 years my days had begun with routine, and that morning I followed the same pattern even though my hands felt heavier than usual. I filled the kettle with water, set it on the stove, and opened the window above the sink. Outside the air carried the early spring smell of wet grass and maple trees. Cedar Ridge was waking up just like any other day. A school bus rumbled down the street. Somewhere a neighbor's garage door lifted. Nothing in the town looked like a place where a mother had just lost her only son. I poured hot water into a mug and sat down with my phone again. I had spent most of the night reading Jason's old messages, moving back through months of conversations. The pattern was always the same. Jason checked in often. He told me where he was traveling. He described small details about the cities he visited. A man like that does not vanish without leaving some trace. I opened the email he sent 10 days earlier once more and read every line carefully. There was still nothing unusual. No hint of trouble. No sudden change in tone. Just Jason being Jason. I stared at the screen and tried to understand how a life could end so suddenly without warning anyone who loved him. That was when another small thought surfaced in my mind. If Jason had truly passed away a week earlier, there should have been official communication from the company that employed him. International companies have procedures. They contact immediate family members. They send formal notices. Rachel had said the company handled everything overseas, yet no one had contacted me. I set the phone down and rubbed my hands together slowly. Grief was still there, heavy and real, but another feeling was beginning to grow beside it. It was a quiet uneasiness, like the faint sound of a door moving somewhere else in the house. Around 9 o'clock the doorbell rang. The sudden sound made my heart jump. For a moment I imagined something impossible, that Jason himself might somehow be standing outside smiling the way he always did when he surprised me with a visit. But when I opened the door it was only Rachel again. She stood on the porch wearing the same composed expression she had worn the day before. In her hand she carried a small gray box about the size of a hardcover book. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation and placed the box carefully on the dining table. The room felt colder the moment she entered. Rachel told me she had returned because the company had finally sent something that belonged to Jason. Her voice remained calm and measured. She said it was all they were able to provide because of the circumstances overseas. I looked at the box and immediately understood what she meant before she even said the word. Ashes. The idea struck my chest like a sudden weight. Rachel lifted the lid and revealed a sealed container inside. Beside it rested a simple metal ring and a folded document. She explained that the ring had been found among Jason's personal belongings. She said the document confirmed the arrangements that had been completed abroad. I did not reach for the container. Instead, I picked up the ring. My fingers trembled slightly as I held it near the window where sunlight touched the metal surface. For years Jason had worn a wedding band with a narrow brushed finish. I had seen it countless times when he shook my hand goodbye or lifted a coffee cup during visits home. The ring resting in my palm now looked similar, but something about it felt unfamiliar. The band seemed thicker. The engraving inside looked different from the one Rachel had once shown me after the wedding. I turned the ring slowly, studying the inner surface while Rachel watched from across the table. She did not appear nervous. She simply waited. I placed the ring back beside the box and looked up at her. Rachel repeated that everything had been handled overseas. She said these were the final belongings Jason had left behind. For a moment neither of us spoke. The quiet stretched across the room like a thin sheet of ice. Then Rachel began explaining practical matters. She said there were financial accounts that needed to be reorganized. She mentioned insurance policies and property documents. She spoke with the calm efficiency of someone organizing paperwork after a business transaction rather than the passing of a husband. I listened without interrupting, but inside my thoughts moved carefully through every detail. The strange delay in telling me about Jason. The company that had never contacted me. The unfamiliar ring lying on the table. Each piece settled into place like part of a puzzle that had not yet revealed its full picture. Rachel finished speaking and folded her hands together. She asked whether I understood the situation. I looked at the gray box on the table and then back at her composed face. My heart still ached with the possibility that my son might truly be gone. Yet beneath that grief another realization was beginning to rise slowly and quietly in my mind. Something about this story did not belong together. And as Rachel stood in my dining room speaking about documents and arrangements, I began to wonder if the truth about Jason Whitmore had not yet been told at all. I did not answer Rachel immediately. I simply sat at the dining table with the gray box between us while the morning sunlight stretched across the polished wood surface. For several seconds the only sound in the room was the faint ticking of the clock hanging above the kitchen doorway. Rachel waited with that same composed expression, her hands folded calmly in front of her as if patience had always been one of her strongest talents. I had known Rachel for 6 years, long enough to recognize that look. It was the expression she used when she believed a conversation had already been decided before it began. I glanced again at the ring resting beside the container. Jason had worn his wedding band every day since the ceremony in Columbus. I remembered how he joked that it felt strange during the first week, like carrying a coin in his pocket that he could never remove. Yet over time the ring became part of him, just another small detail in the life he built with Rachel. The band in front of me looked similar but not identical. The metal was slightly darker and the inside engraving was missing the small date I clearly remembered from the wedding invitation. I picked up the ring again and turned it slowly between my fingers. Rachel noticed the movement and spoke in a gentle voice. She said the company explained that some personal items had been difficult to recover overseas. She said this was the closest match they were able to provide from Jason's belongings. The explanation sounded reasonable if a person wanted it to sound reasonable. But as I studied the ring under the light from the window, a quiet certainty began forming inside my thoughts. Mothers remember details about their children that others forget. I remembered Jason placing his real ring on the kitchen counter once while washing dishes during a visit home 2 summers ago. I remembered the narrow brushed pattern that ran across the surface and the small engraved numbers marking the date of his wedding. The ring in my hand did not carry those marks. I set it down again beside the gray container and folded my hands on the table. Rachel continued speaking about paperwork and arrangements. She explained that Jason had several international accounts connected to his engineering work. She said those accounts needed to be transferred or closed. She mentioned legal documents that would eventually require signatures. Her voice remained steady, professional, almost rehearsed. I listened carefully without interrupting. At 71 years old I had learned that silence can reveal more than arguments ever could. The more Rachel spoke, the more I noticed the direction of her words. She spoke about finances. She spoke about property. She spoke about insurance and ownership and the practical matters that follow when a life ends. What she did not speak about was Jason himself. She did not mention his friends, his work team, or the colleagues who would have known him overseas. She did not speak about grief. She spoke about organization. After a few minutes she finally paused and asked if I had any questions. I looked from the gray box to Rachel's face and considered my response carefully. Inside my chest grief still moved like a slow, heavy tide, but another feeling had begun rising with it. It was the quiet instinct that tells a person something is wrong even when the evidence has not yet appeared. I asked Rachel whether anyone from Jason's company planned to contact me directly. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. Then she explained that international situations were complicated and communication channels were sometimes limited. She said everything had already been confirmed through her as Jason's spouse. Her answer sounded polished, but it did not remove the uneasiness in my thoughts. I nodded slowly and said that I understood. Rachel seemed satisfied with that response. She gathered the documents she had placed on the table and explained that she would return in a few days with additional paperwork that needed attention. Then she lifted the gray box and pushed it gently toward me. She said I should keep Jason's remains in the house where he grew up. According to her, it was the most appropriate place for them. The moment felt strangely formal, as if the closing of a meeting rather than the morning of a life. Rachel stood, adjusted her coat, and walked toward the front door. I followed her into the hallway out of habit. When she stepped onto the porch she paused briefly and told me to rest. She said grief could make people imagine things that were not real. Then she offered a small sympathetic smile before walking down the steps toward her car. I watched from the doorway while she drove away once again, the quiet street swallowing the sound of her engine as it disappeared around the corner. After the car was gone I returned to the dining room and sat down beside the gray box. For several minutes I stared at the sealed container inside it, trying to accept the possibility that my son might truly be gone. But the uneasiness that had followed Rachel's story since the first moment on the porch refused to fade. Instead it grew stronger with every detail that did not quite fit together. Finally I reached for my phone again and opened Jason's contact information. My thumb hovered over the call button for a long moment while the kitchen clock ticked steadily behind me. Rachel had told me my son was gone. The gray box on the table seemed to confirm her story. Yet the unfamiliar ring, the missing company call, and the strange calm in Rachel's voice all pointed in another direction entirely. And as I sat there in the quiet house where Jason had grown up, one thought settled firmly into my mind. If the truth about my son existed somewhere in this world, I was going to find it. I did not press the call button right away. Instead I sat there at the dining table with the phone resting in my palm, listening to the quiet sounds of the house that had once been full of Jason's footsteps. Outside the kitchen window the late morning sun was climbing higher above the rooftops of Cedar Ridge, and the branches of the maple tree in my yard moved gently in the breeze. Everything looked ordinary, peaceful even, yet nothing inside me felt the same. Rachel had left only 20 minutes earlier, but her words were still echoing in my mind. Your son was killed in Iran last week. The sentence sounded final when she spoke it, as if the story was already finished. But the more I thought about it, the more the details began to unravel. I stood up slowly and carried the gray box from the dining table into the living room. I placed it carefully on the coffee table beside the couch where Jason used to sit during his visits home. The sealed container inside the box looked small and impersonal, nothing like the warm, living person I had raised for 40 years. I did not open it again. Instead I sat down and looked around the room. Every corner held some memory of Jason. There was the worn leather chair where he liked to read when he stayed overnight. There was the small bookshelf he built in high school during a woodworking class. Even the faded rug near the fireplace reminded me of the time he spilled an entire cup of hot chocolate there when he was 12 years old. People do not vanish completely when they leave the world. They remain in the objects they touched and the spaces they once filled. I reached for my phone again and opened Jason's contact information. His photograph appeared on the screen, the same photo I had taken during a family picnic at Lake Erie 5 years earlier. He was standing beside the water wearing sunglasses and laughing at something I had said behind the camera. The memory felt so alive that for a moment the idea of his death seemed almost impossible to accept. My thumb hovered over the call button again. Part of me knew that if Rachel was telling the truth, the call would simply reach an inactive line somewhere across the world. But another part of me remembered all the things that did not fit together. The unfamiliar ring. The company that had never contacted me. The calm way Rachel spoke about accounts and paperwork while standing beside what she claimed were Jason's ashes. I pressed the call button before I could change my mind. The phone rang once. Then twice. Then a third time. Each tone felt louder than the last as it echoed through the quiet living room. I held my breath while the sound continued. Finally the ringing stopped. Instead of silence, a recorded voice began speaking in a calm mechanical tone explaining that the number was temporarily unavailable due to international network restrictions. I lowered the phone slowly and stared at the screen. The message had not said the number was disconnected. It had not said the line no longer existed. It had said unavailable. The difference was small, but in that moment it felt important. I leaned back on the couch and closed my eyes, replaying Rachel's story again in my mind. According to her, Jason had passed away a week earlier, yet his phone line was still active enough to trigger a network message. His company had not contacted me directly. The ring she delivered did not match the one he wore. Piece by piece the story she had told me seemed less solid than it first appeared. I stood up again and walked to the hallway where the framed family photographs hung along the wall. One by one I looked at each image until I reached the photograph from Jason and Rachel's wedding day. Jason was standing beside his bride outside the small chapel in Columbus, smiling in that calm, confident way he always had. Rachel stood beside him wearing a white dress and a bright smile that looked almost identical to the polite smile she gave me earlier that morning. I studied the photograph carefully. Jason's hand rested on Rachel's shoulder, and the wedding band was clearly visible on his finger. I stepped closer to the frame and examined the small engraved pattern along the metal surface. The design was narrow and brushed across the band exactly the way I remembered. The ring Rachel had placed on my dining table that morning had been different. I returned to the living room and picked up the gray box again. For several seconds I simply held it there, feeling the unexpected weight of it in my hands. If Jason was truly gone, then this container represented the final physical trace of his life. But if Rachel had lied, then the box sitting in my living room was not a symbol of closure at all. It was evidence that something was deeply wrong. I set the box back on the table and picked up my phone once more. This time I opened my email application and began searching through Jason's previous messages again, paying attention to every small detail. Dates, locations, project names, anything that might lead me towards someone who could confirm the truth. Rachel believed her story had ended the moment she placed that gray box on my table. But as I sat there in the quiet house where my son had grown up, a different realization settled firmly into my mind. If Jason Whitmore was truly gone, would eventually find proof of it. And if he was not, then the woman who stood on my porch and told me he was dead had just started a story she did not expect me to finish. That afternoon I remained in the living room long after the sun had shifted toward the west side of the house. The gray box still rested on the coffee table in front of me, quiet and unmoving, yet it seemed to carry a weight much heavier than its size. For hours I replayed every detail Rachel had given me, measuring each word against the memories I had of my son. By early evening the light inside the room had turned golden, and the long shadows of the maple tree outside stretched across the carpet. I realized I had been sitting there without moving for nearly 2 hours. Finally I stood and walked back into the kitchen where my laptop sat on the small desk beside the refrigerator. Jason had helped me learn how to use that computer several years earlier. He said it was important for me to stay connected with the world even when he was traveling. Now that same laptop might be the only way to reach the truth. I opened the screen and waited while the familiar blue glow filled the quiet room. My hands moved slowly across the keyboard as I searched for the name of the engineering company Jason worked for overseas. I had heard him mention it many times during our Sunday calls. Whitmore Engineering Solutions had partnered with several international firms, and Jason often explained that the projects involved infrastructure work across different countries. Within a few minutes the company website appeared on the screen. It looked professional and well organized, the kind of place that clearly operated on a global scale. I clicked through several pages until I found the section listing company contacts. There were offices in New York, London, and Dubai. I hesitated for a moment before selecting the contact information for the New York office. According to the website, it handled North American operations and employee coordination. If Jason had truly passed away overseas, someone in that office would know about it. I copied the phone number and stared at it for a long moment before dialing. My heart began beating faster with each ring as the call connected. After the third tone, a calm professional voice answered and introduced herself as part of the administrative staff. I explained that my name was Margaret Whitmore and that my son Jason Whitmore worked for their international engineering team. There was a short pause on the line while the woman searched for his name in their system. I held my breath, expecting to hear confirmation of the story Rachel had delivered on my porch. Instead, the woman's voice returned with quiet confusion. She said Jason Whitmore was currently listed as an active field engineer assigned to an overseas infrastructure project. She asked if there was a problem with one of his travel documents. For a moment I could not speak. The room seemed to tilt slightly around me as her words settled into place. Active field engineer. Assigned overseas. Not gone. Not missing. Active. I forced myself to respond calmly and asked whether there had been any report of an incident involving Jason during the past week. The woman answered immediately that there had been no such report. She explained that the company monitored all field staff carefully, especially employees working internationally. If anything serious had happened, the family would have been contacted directly through official channels. She even added that Jason had submitted a routine project update 3 days earlier through their internal system. My hand tightened around the phone while a rush of emotions surged through my chest. Relief, confusion, disbelief, all tangled together so quickly that I had to steady my breathing before speaking again. I thanked the woman for checking the information and told her there must have been some misunderstanding. She offered to send me the contact information for Jason's project coordinator in case I needed confirmation in the future. After the call ended, I remained standing in the kitchen, staring at the silent phone screen while the refrigerator hummed quietly behind me. Rachel had looked directly into my eyes and told me my son was dead. She had placed a gray box in my house and handed me a ring that did not belong to him. Yet according to the company that employed Jason, he was alive and still working overseas. I slowly walked back into the living room where the gray box waited on the coffee table. The room looked exactly the same as it had earlier that afternoon, but everything felt different now. The container that had once seemed like proof of Jason's death now looked like something else entirely. Something staged. Something prepared. I sat down on the couch and folded my hands together while my thoughts moved carefully through the new reality forming in front of me. Rachel believed I would accept her story without question. She believed grief would keep me too weak to look for answers. But the call to New York had changed everything. My son was alive somewhere across the world, and the woman who claimed to be mourning him had brought a false story directly to my door. As the evening light faded through the windows of the house where Jason had grown up, a new understanding settled quietly into my mind. Whatever Rachel was planning had already begun long before she stepped onto my porch. And now that I knew the truth, I intended to discover exactly why. That night I did not turn on the television or the lights in the living room. I sat quietly on the couch while darkness slowly filled the house, the gray box still resting on the coffee table exactly where Rachel had left it. The only light came from the small lamp beside the hallway, casting a soft yellow glow across the floor. My mind kept replaying the conversation with the company office in New York. Jason was alive. The woman had said it clearly and without hesitation. He was active on an overseas project. He had submitted a routine update only 3 days earlier. The certainty of that information settled deep in my chest, pushing away the crushing grief that Rachel had tried to place there. But the relief was quickly replaced by something else. Confusion. Suspicion. And slowly, a quiet determination. I looked at the gray box again and tried to imagine Rachel carrying it into my house earlier that day. She had walked in calmly, explained everything in a careful voice, and then moved quickly to discuss financial matters. Accounts. Documents. Property transfers. At the time I had been too overwhelmed to question it fully, but now the pattern seemed impossible to ignore. Rachel had not come to comfort a grieving mother. She had come to establish a story. I stood up and walked back into the kitchen where the laptop still sat open on the small desk. The screen had gone dark, but with a quick tap of the keyboard the blue light returned. I reopened the company website and looked again at the contact information the woman in New York had mentioned. There was also a name listed for Jason's overseas project coordinator, a man named Daniel Hartwell. His email address appeared beneath the project team listing. I hesitated before writing to him. Jason had always been careful about company rules and international communication. I did not want to cause problems for him by reaching out in the wrong way. But the situation in my house was no longer ordinary. Someone had just tried to convince me that my son was dead. I began typing slowly, choosing my words with care. I explained that I was Jason Whitmore's mother calling from Ohio and that I had recently received alarming information about his status overseas. I asked only one question. Could he confirm whether Jason Whitmore was safe and currently assigned to the project? After sending the message I closed the laptop and returned to the living room. The house felt strangely calm again, as if it too understood that the truth was beginning to surface. I sat down beside the gray box and studied it more carefully than before. The container inside had been sealed with a thin strip of tape, and the label attached to it carried a generic identification number instead of a name. That detail had not stood out to me earlier when grief clouded my thinking. Now it looked suspiciously incomplete. If these ashes truly belonged to Jason, there would have been official documentation with his name, date, and verification from the company or local authorities. Rachel had provided nothing like that. Instead she had brought a simple box and a story. I leaned back against the couch and closed my eyes for a moment. Memories of Rachel from the past 6 years began rising one after another. At first she had seemed polite and attentive when she joined our family. She organized dinners, remembered birthdays, and spoke warmly about the future she planned with Jason. But over time small changes had appeared. She asked questions about Jason's accounts more often. She handled financial paperwork quickly and rarely shared details. When Jason traveled overseas she often spoke about how complicated it was to manage things alone. I had never considered those conversations suspicious before. Now they felt different. The pattern of her behavior slowly rearranged itself in my mind. After a while I opened my eyes and reached for my phone again. I did not call Jason this time. Instead I opened the message application and looked at our previous conversations. The last message from him was still there, cheerful and ordinary, telling me he would call again soon. There was no hint that anything unusual had happened in his life. I set the phone down and looked toward the window where the streetlights outside had just turned on. Cedar Ridge remained quiet and peaceful as always. But inside my home the story Rachel had started was already beginning to unravel. I did not know exactly what she planned to gain by telling me Jason was gone. Perhaps she believed that with him overseas no one would question the story. Perhaps she thought grief would keep me from looking deeper. But the call to New York had already changed everything. My son was alive somewhere across the world. The gray box on my table was not the end of a life. It was the beginning of a lie. And as the house settled into the silence of the evening, one decision became clear in my mind. I was not going to confront Rachel yet. Not until I understood exactly what she had been trying to do. For now I would remain quiet, just as she expected. But while she believed her story had been accepted, would be watching carefully, waiting for the moment when the truth revealed itself completely. The next morning arrived slowly and quietly, just like every other morning in Cedar Ridge. The sunlight filtered through the thin kitchen curtains and painted pale gold lines across the wooden floor. I had slept very little, but my mind felt clearer than it had the day before. The gray box still rested on the coffee table in the living room exactly where it had been left. The sealed container inside it looked no different than it had 24 hours earlier, but now it felt less like a symbol of grief and more like a piece of evidence waiting to be understood. I made a pot of coffee and carried my mug into the living room, sitting down carefully beside the box. My phone rested in my hand while I watched the quiet street outside. Children walked toward the corner bus stop with their backpacks, and a mail truck rolled slowly past the house. Everything in town continued as if nothing unusual had happened. Yet inside my home a lie had already taken root. Just after 9 o'clock my laptop chimed softly from the kitchen desk. The sound startled me slightly, and I walked quickly down the hallway to check the screen. The email application was open, and a new message had appeared in my inbox. The sender's name was Daniel Hartwell. My heart began beating faster as I opened the message. The words were brief but clear. Daniel introduced himself as the overseas project coordinator for Jason's engineering team. He wrote that he had received my email and wanted to reassure me immediately that Jason Whitmore was safe and actively working at the project site. According to his message, Jason had participated in a project meeting only 2 days earlier and had scheduled another update later in the week. Daniel even apologized if there had been any confusion regarding Jason's status and offered to arrange a direct communication if needed. I read the message 3 times before closing the laptop slowly. The final piece of uncertainty inside my mind disappeared in that moment. Jason was alive. Not missing. Not gone. Alive and working exactly where he was supposed to be. I returned to the living room and sat down again beside the gray box. The quiet house seemed almost to breathe with relief, but that feeling quickly gave way to a deeper question. If Jason was alive overseas, then why had Rachel stood on my porch and told me he was gone? Why had she brought a container of ashes and a ring? That did not belong to him. I leaned forward and studied the box carefully. The tape across the lid had been placed neatly, almost professionally, yet there were no official markings from any international service. No identification beyond the simple number printed on the label. I reached out and touched the edge of the container with my fingers, feeling the cool surface beneath the tape. It felt ordinary. Too ordinary for something that was supposed to represent the end of a life. I sat back and thought about Rachel again. She had promised to return within a few days with more documents. At the time it sounded like the next step in handling a tragedy. Now it sounded like the next step in whatever plan she had already begun. I remembered how quickly she had started talking about accounts and property after delivering the news. She had spoken about transferring control of certain financial matters because Jason was no longer there to manage them himself. At the time the words had passed through my grief without much resistance. Now they stood out sharply. Rachel had not simply told me a story about Jason's death. She had prepared a path forward based on that story. A path that involved paperwork and ownership and control. I placed my coffee mug on the table and folded my hands together, thinking carefully about the next move. Confronting Rachel immediately would only warn her that the lie had been discovered. If she was planning something involving Jason's accounts or property, she would simply adjust her strategy and disappear behind new explanations. No, the truth would come out much more clearly if she believed her story was still working. I picked up my phone and opened my messages again. Jason's last message was still there, cheerful and simple, promising to call soon. I resisted the urge to reply. For now it was better that Jason did not know what had happened. Whatever Rachel was doing had been carefully planned, and it would be easier to understand if she continued believing I accepted her version of events. I looked around the living room once more. The gray box remained silent on the table, the false ring still resting beside it exactly where Rachel had placed it. In a strange way the box had become useful. It was proof that Rachel had taken the story far enough to stage evidence. I leaned back slowly against the couch and watched the quiet movement of tree shadows across the window. Rachel believed she had convinced a grieving mother that her son was gone. She believed the house behind me was filled with sorrow instead of questions. In a few days she would return expecting that grief to continue. But by the time Rachel stepped onto my porch again, the story she had built would no longer belong to her. Because now I knew the truth. And the moment she walked through my door again would be the moment her carefully constructed life finally began to fall apart.